Good evening. This is going to be a quick question for Karen Strawn, potential, I guess, in her Honey Badger Brigade, all her affiliate female MRAs out there.
Hi there, Mr. Male Chauvinist Pig. I don't generally respond to every video or email or comment directed at me, but I've been wanting to discuss some of the issues you raise in this one for a little while, so I'm going to use your questions as a jumping off point for something that I really wanted to talk about anyway. I will, of course, be answering for myself alone. The opinions of the honey badgers may differ from mine on a number of points, and I am not speaking for them or for the group in general. So, let's get started.
I want to ask a question to see, because you claim to be anti-feminist, from what I understand. Now, Karen, I haven't watched all your videos, nor do I care to, because I think personally women in male rights is ludicrous.
You have a right to that opinion. There have been other men who have said as much to me over the years. Women don't belong in the men's movement. Women shouldn't be leaders within the men's movement. Yada, yada, yada. Usually, this is said to me by men who either don't do a whole lot in terms of activism or public outreach and awareness raising, or who do a lot but don't really get very far. I would suggest that women don't belong in the men's movement is as fallacious as saying adults don't belong in the children's rights movement or humans don't belong in the animal rights movement. The idea that a woman can't witness an injustice and then want to participate in some form of action to correct it just because that injustice is perpetrated against men or boys, that's kind of silly. Women have men and boys in their lives that they care about. We have a vested interest in the general health of our societies and the individuals around us. And women also have a history of advocacy and community work, some of it politicized, and a lot of it happening long before women's suffrage was a twinkle in anybody's eye. Now, this kind of sentiment that women don't belong in the men's movement, I think it's a reflection, it's sort of a mirror of what has been happening over the last century and a half. I mean, feminism has spent almost 170 years training society to see men and women as members of opposing teams at best, warring nations at worst, and that women's interests are separate and distinct from those of men and even children, and that these interests are competing rather than shared. So I don't tend to see things that way. I tend to see it as men and women are fellow travelers and we should actually be helping each other. And finally, my success in this, that was not a choice I made. I didn't appoint myself by fiat. I didn't barge into radio stations or other people's podcasts demanding to be heard, and I hardly put any effort into promoting my work, other than showing up where I'm invited and saying what I say. I'm well known as an MRA and an anti-feminist because I'm effective at it, and part of the reason I'm effective is because I'm a woman. People new to the topic will listen to me when they wouldn't listen to a man because I don't scare them, and because there's a perception that I am not speaking out of self-interest. So I see myself acting as both an icebreaker, a non-intimidating introduction to the topic for people new to it, as well as a shield of sorts for the men in the movement. My existence within men's rights and anti-feminism is at least some kind of evidence that the men's movement isn't just about hating women, or that anti-feminism isn't just about hating women.
But that being said, I'd like to ask you, if you are anti-feminist, and I don't think you're here in the United States, but let's use this theoretically as a theoretical question. Are you willing to give up your right to vote?
Yes. Okay, granted, in the 29 years I have enjoyed the right to vote, I have rarely exercised it. I voted in the first federal election I was eligible to, I guess out of youthful enthusiasm, and then I didn't vote in another one until I was facing the appalling possibility of living in a majority NDP province in a majority NDP country. And just for you Americans out there, the NDP are about as far left as Ralph Nader, or Bernie Sanders. Now, other than that, I have voted in a couple of municipal elections when there was something important on the agenda that would affect my community directly. In other words, if I lost my right to vote, it wouldn't exactly leave a huge gaping void in my life. But given that you specifically said the US, I'm guessing that you're talking about selective service registration. Now, were I in the US, I would certainly be prepared to adhere to my principles and give up my right to vote, at least until selective service was done away with. Canada has a less shitty history regarding military service and the vote. Back in World War I, when our conscription legislation was enacted, the act granted the right to vote to all members of the military present and past, voluntary or drafted, male or female, regardless of age. So we wouldn't have had young drafted men returning home injured or maimed from a war without them also having the right to vote. And, no, we don't have selective service registration here in Canada, but just like with martial law, a draft, if it ever becomes necessary again, that's just one executive decision away. So, basically, what I'm saying is yes, I would be willing to give up my right to vote. Although I'm also in favor of including women in selective service registration and any future draft. Every argument I've seen against doing so has been a complete non sequitur or red herring, and the entire objection seems to boil down to, how dare we inconvenience women? As far as all women's right to vote, while I believe you are barking up a hopeless, hopeless tree, as far as getting that revoked, I do believe that the injustice of having two classes of citizens, both of whom have the right to vote, but only one of whom must pay for it with a promised reciprocal obligation to the state, that should be able to be discussed as the glaring inequity that it is. In fact, when I was interviewing alongside Janet Bloomfield at CTV Studios, the interviewer brought up the sort of maternal suffrage argument. Yes, men die in war, and they're expected to, but women are expected to give birth to the next generation of soldiers. And Janet, the badass that she is, left the interviewer absolutely speechless when she basically argued, okay, so let's say there's a draft. I'm guessing you're okay with the government requiring, on pain of prison, that all women of fertile age who are biologically capable be impregnated and forced to give birth. Or are you prepared to admit that birthing the next generation of soldiers is not quite the expectation that you are portraying it as? I also believe that the negative consequences of women's suffrage are as proper a subject for debate and discussion as any other. To believe there were no negative consequences in terms of law and policy and the size of government and all of that is to believe either that women are superior to men, that all the consequences were positive, or that they vote no differently than men, that there were no consequences at all. At which point you'd have to ask yourself, why would we need women to vote at all if the outcomes are the same as if they didn't?
Because why I ask you that is because, see, I believe all waves of feminism have been disastrous. Through the first wave, through the third wave, and whatever else you've gone into, intersectional, and everything in between.
I agree. It's been poison from the beginning.
Are you and your anti-feminist friends or red-pilled women out there prepared to give up your rights?
Again, I can't speak for all anti-feminists, only for myself, and it would depend on what rights you're talking about, and whether I would receive in return for giving up those rights the entitlements, protections, and privileges women were owed before women had those rights. I mean, coverture was no picnic for men, Mr. Pig. So, basically, if you want me to answer that, you're going to have to be more specific.
If the answer is yes, well, maybe there's a ground then to talk about and continue the conversation. If the answer is no, then there's nothing to talk about.
There's always something to talk about. Like, what rights are you expecting me to give up? And what do I get in return? Your question is essentially like Russia demanding the US engage in complete unilateral nuclear disarmament and then saying if the US isn't willing to say they'll do it, regardless of context, there's just nothing more to talk about.
I think you should have no, at least political rights to vote. I think you women, in general, are destructive.
Again, I think there's an argument to be made there, although if you want anyone to listen to you, you have to actually make that argument. Women in general are destructive when they have political or voting rights. That's an assertion, not an argument, and no one is obligated to just take your word for it. You need to demonstrate it. And honestly, I haven't seen your other videos, but from this one, anti-suffragette women did a much better job of making that case than you are here.
Now, I know that's very, very unpopular.
Yeah, when I suggested to Cenk Uygur or the Young Turks that women should not have received the vote when they did, or the way they did, he lost his frickin' mind and screamed at me to make him a ham sandwich. So I think unpopular is probably an understatement. Women's right to vote and the brave, honorable, selfless, equality-minded paragons of feminine justice and virtue who made it happen, they are not to be even honestly examined, let alone questioned or objected to. And the already politically active women who at the time used their already powerful political voices to win for me the voting rights I can barely be arsed to exercise, rights without which I allegedly would not have a political voice at all. If you so much as argue the circular nature of that reasoning, that women were politically active and powerful before they gained political power, they label you a misogynist and a lunatic. Anyway, it's very, very, very difficult to discuss any of these matters without people losing their shit.
And I know it's not a popular opinion, especially amongst a lot of these MRAs.
Well, of course it's not. Most MRAs favor straight equal rights and responsibilities across the board. They want men to be liberated from gender role enforcement the way women have. From the position of men, they look back at the history of men and women as different citizens with different rights, responsibilities, entitlements, and obligations, and they like the male side of the bargain no better than the suffragettes and second waivers like the female side. To them, the answer is not to go backwards, removing rights and privileges and opportunities women have gained, but to extend equal or equitable rights, privileges, and opportunities to men and to remove men's gendered obligations to women and society. There's certainly a discussion to be had as to whether that's feasible. How do we have a society where everyone is free to do whatever they want without any obligation to anyone but themselves? I mean, that's a question we could ask. Now, second-wave feminists in particular, including kooks like Dworkin, argued that men's liberation from the male gender role would come about as a natural consequence of women's liberation from the female role. Once women were liberated from the traditional wife and mother role, they said, men would be freed from the traditional breadwinner role. Women could not, they said, be equal to men in the workplace until men became equal as parents. Of course, on paper, it all looked wonderful. In reality, it isn't happened like that. It just hasn't worked out that way. And why would it? We liberated women from their end of the bargain while still maintaining their entitlement to superior support, compassion, and protection. Why would they give up all those goodies now? When you can have a career and sole custody of the kids and child support and extra help from the government when you need it, why on earth would you be willing to make any concessions at all? Especially when you have a Greek chorus full of shrieking harpies in pussy hats constantly going on about how you still have things worse in every conceivable situation, and how men still run everything and have everything so easy and are bent on oppressing you.
So, Karen, if you can tell me, and you've also mentioned, I saw a couple of your videos, I'd like to ask you, what part of feminism do you disagree with? You said you're against modern feminism. What does that entail? Is that second, third wave? What is that entailing?
Okay, and here's where you clearly demonstrate what you said earlier. You haven't really followed my videos or my work. I've been at this for 8 or 9 years now. When I started, I was looking primarily at third and second wave feminism. Intersectionality hadn't really become quite as mainstream and popular back then. And I mostly ignored the first wave as immaterial to the context of most of what I was discussing in terms of advocacy for men. And there's general difficulty in terms of accessing original texts going that far back. So, what we're really left with in terms of somebody who doesn't have access to a university library, we're left with in terms of the readily accessible history of the first wave, and to a lesser extent the second, is the glowing, pristine black and white narrative of the brave suffragettes who only wanted equality and had to fight long and hard for it because men in the past were oppressive bastards who were just denying women that equality just because they were women. Now, I learned about the suffragette movement in middle school. I learned the lily whitewashed version of all of that. But I never learned about, say, the Chartists until I began investigating the first wave of feminism, working my way back through the historical record to not only uncover what changes the first wave brought about, but what the laws looked like before they changed them, what parts were changed and what parts were not, and so on. Now, until you've done that, it's very easy to believe this graphic. The belief that the feminist concept of the patriarchy is an invention of 1960s feminism, and that first wave feminism wasn't about man-hating or man-blaming, that it was merely a movement advocating equality and greater fairness between men and women. And then you read this, right? The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpation on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. Hard not to see that as a declaration that men are enemies and oppressors. Hard not to see it as a statement of intention to dismantle the patriarchy. And frankly, the victories of the first wave need to be put into the broader context of the entire body of laws, not just individual statutes. The draft, particularly in the US, and particularly after the SCOTUS decision upholding it in, I think it was 1917 or 1918, that should never have been seen as an issue completely separate and discrete from that of women's suffrage or suffrage more generally. But perhaps even more appalling were the Married Women's Property Acts, beginning in the UK in the mid-1800s and spreading across the West. These were reforms that isolated a single aspect of an entire constellation of interrelated and interdependent laws detailing the rights and responsibilities of husbands and wives, and subjected that aspect and that aspect alone to sweeping reforms. Now, these reforms removed married women's property and income from the institution of marriage itself, while the laws requiring the husband to be financially responsible for providing everything she and the children required, those remained intact, as did her legally protected interest in his real property via dower rights. So he didn't fully even own the family home because she could prevent him from selling it. Now, these reforms provided married women not with equal rights, but with superior rights to their own earnings and property than married men had to theirs. Now, every single change I have found that was brought about by early women's activism, whether by women who called themselves suffragettes or women who did not, failed utterly to look at the male side of the situation or to view the legal handicaps of women and privileges of men within the broader context of men's handicaps and women's privileges. A friend of mine who comments in various places online presented it this way, and I'm going to amend that graphic accordingly. Now, the fact that they have been able to manage all of these things with so little opposition from the powers that be or from men in general is kind of amazing. The fact that they've been able to do it while still convincingly maintaining the grand public fiction that women were oppressed and that they are still oppressed, while men are privileged across the board, that is nothing short of stunning.
Are you just against third wave? What periods are you? What I'm trying to get at is that either you renounce every aspect of it, which is first through third wave and everything in between that, and if not, I consider you a phony.
And I don't say any of this to prove to you or those like you that I'm not a fake. And I don't say it so that you'll be willing to talk to me, because frankly, I have more people to talk to about stuff like this than I can shake a stick at. But I want you to keep something in mind, Mr. Peg, especially when you go expounding on the ridiculousness of people other than men being in the men's rights movement. Some of the most lopsided and brutal legislative reforms brought about by women's advocacy, like that situation through the turn of the last century where the husband was still 100% financially responsible for his family, including his wife, but no longer had any legal access to his wife's income and property to help him do that. Most of those changes happened before women had access to elected office as politicians or to the ballot box as voters. Female advocates petitioned the men in power, and the men in power gave them what they wanted, often with nothing even resembling an objection, let alone a fight. And it had not been for the strength of the female anti-suffragette movement, I suspect women would have gotten the vote long before they actually did. Still, for what it is worth, one finds that from 1890 to 1906, only 193,000 women signed petitions to this House in favor of female suffrage, and that during the last 18 months, a period in which a strong anti-suffrage association has been in existence, 300,000 women, some of them eminent women, have signed petitions against it, and to the effect that these proposals shall not be forced upon them. A rather interesting illustration was furnished by an inquiry which was instituted by the Sheffield Independent, a newspaper which I think itself is sympathetic with these proposals. This inquiry was addressed to the women householders of Sheffield. 23,000 papers were sent out, and of the replies, 9,000 were in favor of women's suffrage and 14,000 were against it. The representatives of this paper reported that in many cases their emissaries were chased with violence from the houses by the female inhabitants under the impression that they were collecting statistical matter as the emissaries of the suffragist party.
Thank you for your time. Good evening.